Hello, everybody. We're going live with Carlos Morales. Thank you for joining us for this special on the occasion of the exhibition, The Spine of Music. This is an exhibition honoring Joaquín Orellana. Hello, hello.
Hola.
Hola, ¿qué
How
tal?
are you?
I'm very good. How are you? How are you doing? Thank you so
Bien,
much.
¿tú?
Muy bien. Thank you so much for
Fine, thank you.
joining today. So I was explaining to the audience, for those of you that are joining today, we have the honor of talking today with Carlos Morales as part of a special in the studio series called The Spine of Music. This is the title of our exhibition honoring Joaquín Orellana, the Guatemalan composer and musician. And we have in that exhibition a series of contemporary artists that have done work on and around Orellana. In this case, we're talking with Carlos, and we're going to go through all of his career. We're going to talk a little bit about his work with Orellana, but we're going to take this as an opportunity to also get to know his work better and share it with our audience and people that see us live and then later in the archive. So, gracias. Thank you so much, Carlos, for being with us and for accepting our invitation.
No, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice. And well, it's very nice to talk with you. So I'm here in my studio, the empty canvas in the back,
Nice.
working on different things and ready to speak with you. I hope the connection is good.
Yeah, it's good. We're hearing you. We're hearing you well, perfectly. And perhaps, Carlos, you want to start telling people, I mean, you are in Mexico DF, where you live, and I don't know if you want to share with them a little bit of what you're doing. We can see your studio if you want, or we can just go to the slides. If you have anything you want.
Let's go in the studio so I can give a little view.
Lovely.
This is my room, and this is the room where I normally work. So I have some empty canvas, and I'm making like a big collage. So well,
nice.
Smaller ones too, but also this very large one, which has taken me a lot of pieces. And it's all these pieces that I'm gluing here. So it's like a very manual work. So
nice.
For the first time after this long pandemic, I'm doing what you can call like proper artwork.
Nice. Did it took you a long time? Was it hard at the beginning to work?
Yeah, it was very strange. I guess for everybody it's kind of the same or in a similar way. But yeah, in the beginning I was just mostly watching the news and trying to understand what's going on, and you know, like it was very hard to concentrate. And then it came this idealistic moment where you think, okay, what can I do as an artist? Should be something different. The possibility to do, you know, like exhibitions in the regular way. So that opened other kind of research and other possibilities. I was writing a lot, so that's been very interesting from the last year. But then finally in October, I was able to land and start to think, okay, I want to make some art piece. And then I could get finally into that mood. So
I think it's important.
I call it the Onkawara effect.
Nice, the Onkawara effect.
Yes.
Nice.
Which is like you do the same thing every day, very quietly, and you just enjoy, time passes by. So it's been good. It's like almost therapeutical.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's very important. I mean, as you know, we've been doing this series since the beginning of the pandemic, and we've been talking with different artists. And something that has came up for a lot of them is that they have to face this social fantasy that artists live in quarantine the whole time, and that artists get their creativity, and that they're used to work in a situation like this, or writers, and people assume that this is the perfect moment for artists and writers and people that work from home. And no, I mean, this is a super stressing moment for all of us. I mean, just because you don't have to go to an office, I mean, Yeah.
Sure. I mean, we are also part of a larger reality. So we also have
Hmm.
children, or, we have family, we have to deal with stuff. We
Children
also
that
worry
don't
about,
go to school. Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and
Hmm.
all this transformation and what is to have
Hmm.
them at home, or also wondering how to produce or how to keep on, like making an economy. So it's really, we have that. I mean, I think in a certain way, we're kind of used to uncertainty. So there is something uncertain about being an artist. In that sense, I guess it has helped.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you also have your own program. So you have your own world. I often
Hmm.
compare making art to play. So, okay, it's like you have all this time to play, to be alone. But
Hmm.
still, like for instance, I'm quite a social artist, so I need to be speaking with people. I work with people. I have a team. I really like to be in conversation.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
suddenly you have this kind of very strange thing. The other effect, which has been really, really weird and tiring, is like all these kind of new groups of WhatsApp, in WhatsApp, and all these discussions continuously, like
Instagram Live.
Zoom and Instagram, and
I
like
know.
all this new sociality. But it's been very
Absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, no.
difficult,
Yes,
but
absolutely.
interesting.
Anyway, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm gonna start sharing some slides. You might lose me, but maybe we can start like telling a little bit about the history of your work. Give me 1 second. You might lose sight of me, but you'll see what is important, which is the work, because there's a small glitch on Instagram that they have since the latest update.
All
So,
right. Uh, so you want me to speak about these pieces?
sure, absolutely. I mean, what we're gonna see here is a selection of works that Carlos
Okay.
suggested. Yeah.
So this is quite, let's say, a new piece. It's from last year, and
Mm-hmm.
I made it first for a small exhibition in Spain, but actually I presented for the first time, let's say, in a more open, public, public way.
Mm-hmm.
For the exhibition I did last year at the Stedelijk Museum. So this view comes from here. So this was right in the entrance. This was the entrance into the museum. What you don't see in the picture is that in the opposite wall to the three heads, there is a repetition of the same. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when you come in, it's a neon piece, by the way. So when you come in, it's like if you enter into a crowd watching at this performer, or
Mm-hmm.
which could be a dancer or not. It's very ambiguous,
Mm-hmm.
and it creates this kind of feeling of watching into a peeping hole, like watching somebody watching, or
Mm-hmm.
being a bouillere of somebody being a bouillere.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has this kind of ambiguity where you don't know, like, what it's really about. Like, you don't know if the people are worried as they're looking, or they're interested, or they're enjoying it, or if the dancer is really a dancer or somebody else. It has this kind of, it's a drawing where you see like a double ass. So it could
Mm-hmm.
look like if it was movement, like insinuating movement, for instance, in a comic, or it could be like a monster.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and this is part of a larger series
Mm-hmm. Very nice. And this is
that comes like,
and where was this shown recently? If you want to share with the audience.
uh, it was first shown in Madrid in a gallery called Albarrán Bourdois. That was
Mm-hmm.
like a very small version.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference here is that you could see the show through a peephole, so from the window.
Nice.
So that was funny. And then it was shown at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, where
Nice.
many of the pictures that you select come from there.
Mm-hmm. Here we
Like
have
for
more.
instance this one, which was a
Mm-hmm.
piece that you could see later. It's called Orgy of Narcissus.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all weaving, so it's a textile piece. It's the idea of the panorama, like
Mm-hmm.
it was covering these four walls. So once you go inside, you can get lost in the panorama.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the way I developed it was kind of by drawing and copying, a bit kind of mimicking by hand this idea of copy paste.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say making an image, then copying it and copying it, and keep on, in a way that there were all these variations starting to happen. So it's a bit like the story of one character that is being copied and copied and copied. So it's kind of transformed. It's very much based on this idea of the meme, you know, the meme internet and how it's taken by somebody else and how it starts to become anonymous. So I was trying to replicate, let's say, like an internet phenomena or this kind of new, I call it like a new narration or a new way of narrating, which of course becomes more, let's say, less personal. It's not a narration that comes from an author, but it's more like the public that starts to create this narration. But I was trying, let's say, to embody it or to bring it to myself, to see if I was able to copy or replicate that kind of, well, what I feel is like a new format or a new possibility. And then they were weaved. So then I was bringing them again into a machine kind of process. I mean, you don't see the details here. Looks like there is nothing.
No,
and then later I showed the drawings at Kurimansuto. This was this year. This was in September, so it was finally the possibility to again be able to show things for real. So I was very, very happy about that. So it's kind of a similar situation, but where you can see this, like the evolution of these drawings. But those are like drawings on paper, while the others, which are bigger, but they're weavings. So
yes, here we
like
have
for
a few
instance
more.
here. So they almost become like comics. So for instance, in this part of the series, what I do was to split the paper on a grid. So for instance, simulating time. So then like other factors starts to happen because it was really like an evolutionary process.
Absolutely. And don't you think that there's also something in this language, you know, of the meme, almost of a language that is based on images in a way that we haven't seen since like maybe the hieroglyphics, you know? There's a codification of images that is taking place thanks to the internet, of these images that, you know, these memes that might have, you know, they do have a text that accompanies the image, but they become kind of like a code that becomes like, you know, a kind of like universal language. And I feel like icons in like WhatsApp communication and texting have taken that role also, you know, like this reduction of certain feelings to an image, a codified image.
Yeah, well, they call it puns. So the idea is to always use this almost like the same image or a well-known image, and then you write a joke. And the joke is basically what is changing. So there is like this kind of strange relation between image and text. So that was also the way I started to slowly introduce text. I was also introducing them as hashtags. So they were not just like, let's say, like ordinary text or poetry, but it was this kind of reference, which I also found interesting because the hashtags have this kind of like very, very odd superficiality. Like they almost are like advertisement, or they have this kind of feeling of desire.
Yeah, the
It's like a
slogan, which always
slogan.
had, and the slogan always had this connotation of being like either very political or very advertising.
Yeah. And it has this kind of feeling like of wanting to belong to something, you know? So like if you put contemporary art, New York, you know, it has this kind of aspirational thing. So I really like this kind of idea because it showed some kind of vanity. But I was just writing like this very absurd hashtag, like really nonsense.
Okay, sorry. So I'm going back to the following project.
And this is, again, I don't know if people can see it, but this is a piece I did for the last 2 years. Yeah. Which I was using people posing against the wall as stencils. And then I was like painting from behind them. So what you see is like the projection of the paint, and then what stays there is the body. It started here. So this was more, for instance, playing with the idea of the museographer. Like, you know, when you're building an exhibition and you want to hang a painting, you ask somebody to present it for you. You know, to see if it's the right height or if it's the. So I was playing with that idea. So I had people kind of presenting these pictures. But it has a strange effect because it feels like the shades are behind the picture. So it kind of creates like an opposite reading. It's
Yes,
almost
absolutely.
like a play of, between negative and positive. So for
Absolutely,
instance, what
because
is in front looks like behind.
mm-hmm.
Or it has, or for instance, what is closer to the wall becomes very detailed. So for instance, the hands, as they are like really touching the wall, they
Mm-hmm.
really mark and become super detailed, and the body, which is further, starts to
Mm-hmm.
become a bit out of focus. So it's a bit like a camera obscura effect. And while doing them and thinking about what kind of scenes or what could they represent, I started to think that it would be interesting to make this kind of demonstration, like
Mm-hmm.
kind of body of work. And it's what became here. This was commissioned in Berkeley by the museum, by the BAMFA. So
Mm-hmm.
it was really like going back into something very traditional, I would say, in Mexico, which is like make a mural. We all come from muralists. And it was super interesting because suddenly it was really like having to deal with a medium, which is basically like the quintessential medium of Mexican art history. That's something like since the 50s is being rejected. We don't want to deal with it. The last thing you want to be associated as a Mexican artist is a muralist. So suddenly the
Yeah.
chance to work on a mural and to see what is the impact of that or what it is as a medium, it became super interesting. I conceived this
Mm-hmm.
piece as an ongoing protest. So it
Mm-hmm.
was interesting because I did it there, and then I did it, for instance, at Trees in London, in the entrance hall of an art fair, or I did it in another museum in Monterrey. So there was this kind of idea of a simultaneity of a
Mm-hmm.
protest going on. So it became kind of a
Absolutely.
trying to think about it like a year later when suddenly they start all this protests around the world. So I don't know. I had yeah,
Absolutely.
I have a heart for these things. That's it.
Yes, absolutely. And there's something very, I think, important to think about now, in these terms in which we have like both like an important like protest movement earlier in the year with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in this moment in which we are sadly like seeing so many anonymous names of people, masses. You see numbers of COVID, and those numbers are like undefined people. This idea of the representation of the mass, like the
Mm.
idea, this sum of individualities in which like individuality is lost, but at the same time it becomes like a like an entity on its own. I think it's very important to see these images right now and to see images of bodies, to
Mm.
be reminded of the idea of the body in this moment,
Hmm.
which it's so
Yeah,
relevant.
I mean, I mean that piece is exactly like the registration of a body.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's almost like painting up in a primitive cave. It's really
Yeah,
like the hand that was sprayed. So it has this very tactile feeling. On the other
absolutely.
hand, I mean, I,
Sorry.
there is, there is this new character, in the political panorama, which is like the mass, and
Exactly.
it's this new personaje, like a
Mm-hmm.
character,
Yeah.
and it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
disquieting. I wouldn't say totally scary, but there is something very strong and very uncontrollable about masses. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a big issue now to think what's your relation, let's say, between individual and the mass. I mean, I think part of the scare, for instance, or at least that's how it feels in Mexico with COVID, is that
Mm-hmm.
it feels like hospitals which are filled with people. There is no more space, and they become like a machine of sick people. Like you are as an individual, you're really scared to fall into this kind of mass. In this kind of
Absolutely.
machine of the mass. So, yeah, to me it was strange to see that this work somewhere appeared 2 years before what's going on now or before last year, and
Mm-hmm.
to start to feel there was like a very strong connection between that. For instance, what you said, the anonymity of the people. Of course, we
Mm-hmm.
know about certain names, famous people, or presidents that get sick, or people who died. But there is this kind of numbers every day that just become like, yeah, ungraspable.
Absolutely, and especially if you want to read, which I know you don't, but if one were to read is the history of muralism, when one of the tricks that muralists always try to do was like include portraits of famous or specific people into the representation, the same way that Renaissance painters did. They would like paint a mass, but like include portraits of friends or the donor or something among that mass of people to, in a way, like send a clue to the viewer. But there's something, in a way, I think this is a super democratic clue that you're sending to the viewer through the fact that, like it's this masses of bodies, because it could be any of us, it's very clear this way that this could be any of us included here. In the bad sense, but also in the good sense, the possibility of inviting people to political participation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the other side, no? That's the other side when it becomes interesting because, as you say, it allows participation too.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the next project.
Well, this is a project that in a strange way also relates to mass. I mean, I'm not gonna go so much into the formal thinking about this project, but at the end, what represents the film is the story of a family that is being lynched. And it has kind of the same idea, like when the mass or the mob becomes uncontrollable, and how far it can judge, something right or wrong. It has a bit the same feeling of the last piece, in the sense of that the situation is kind of put to the public in a very open way. So it's not about this specific problem, it's not about issues, but it's more, let's say, in general. So, for instance, what happens in the film is suggest. So you see a small family that approach a village, and then you see that in the village people start to talk about them, and that they start to gossip about them, and that starts to escalate until it becomes a rumor, until they become violent and kind of catch them and basically lynch them. So it's kind of, like it's interesting for me because it's almost like I noticed that it's like an ongoing subject in my work, like this relation between the individual and the mass. So, for instance, very early in my career, when I was doing these wrestling games, like this kind of character, like wrestling shows, there was this kind of very strong relation between, let's say, the characters in the wrestling ring and then the public. So it was really about this tension. Or later I worked with this record label, Nuevos Ricos, where we also had to deal with large masses of public, Sometimes we had 1,000 people in the concert. So I noticed that it's between this tension that is something that has been kind of slowly evolving through the work, like almost it was a subject. I guess has to do that I'm a lonely child, so perhaps I'm more sensitive to masses.
Yeah. Before we go to the next project, I put the image, but I want to say, people, if they have any questions, they can send them to the chat and I will try to insert it into our conversation. So please feel free to participate, to everybody. So here, I mean, I love this image. I don't know if you want to explain people a little bit what is going on here.
This is kind of almost the end of the film, because the film happens it's like a proto animation or a half animation. So what happens there is that, let's say you are into the world of what is going on. You are, let's say, into the characters, into what's happening. As I said, the lynching, it becomes a drama. But then there is this moment where there is this possibility to zoom out, and then you see there is like an artifice. So you see the musicians who are creating the music for the film performing around the film, and then you also see the puppet master. So it's a bit like this kind of distancing effect,
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like when the Nouvelle Vague would like show the making of the movie during the movie. And I think that's something. Yeah.
Abbas Kiarostami, I was reading that for instance in Iranian film, they have this kind of state duty, like the state tells them that somewhere in the film they have to show that it's a film, otherwise people will think it's just real. So they have
Oh
to
my
have
God,
this
that's
kind of
beautiful.
distance.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really great, And so, for instance, in Kiarostami's film, it's often at the end, suddenly the camera goes out and you see a crew working
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah.
It's this idea of the mise en abîme, no? This kind
Mm-hmm.
of like creating this kind of distancing loop where you become conscious
Of what you're
of
seeing.
what you are watching. You are just
Mm-hmm.
over there. You are not just there into the
Yeah,
work, but you see yourself watching the work or something like that.
absolutely. Um, so what about this one and the next one? Maybe I can show them both so people get a sense of
Well, this
the
one are
scale.
two
Mm-hmm.
actually. So here I combined two pieces. One is called
Mm-hmm.
"Learn to Fuck Yourself," which is a wall painting again,
Mm-hmm.
and the one in the middle is called Dark Mirror. That's a sculpture,
Mm-hmm.
and the sculpture is it's interesting because it's a 3D piece. It's something. It's quite an old piece now. I mean, maybe it's like
Mm-hmm.
15 years old or a bit less. But it was this experiment of creating one of the forms of my archive or one of the forms that I use a lot in 3D and then print it as a sculpture. But then also
Mm-hmm.
what I did was to subdivide it and to, let's say, break it into parts. So
Nice.
it's very formal. So I took the image of the bird and then I broke it or like cut it with the image of a spider web, let's say through the lines. So
Mm-hmm.
it creates this kind of feeling of something that, like crash in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, another, let's say, important subject that has kind of appeared through the work, which is the idea of fragmentation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what I'm kind of researching now. Like suddenly I realized that a lot of my work is actually about fragmenting pieces
Mm-hmm.
or building things together, a bit like what I showed you just before I'm doing in my studio.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also, let's say, a much more formal issue, but to me it's also very interesting because then you start to realize that there are perhaps not only, let's say, subjects or themes that
Mm-hmm.
come through time in the work, like as I was saying, the relation of the individual with the mass, but there is also these other formal parts, which suddenly start to emerge. So that's something that I'm becoming more and more interested. And the back is a wall painting. It's painted with
Yeah.
gouache directly on the wall,
Nice.
where I took all these different images from a book about the Middle Ages, where you
Mm-hmm.
see from, like from religious representations to just like folk or to things that are happening, like people drinking wine or workers.
Mm-hmm.
So I just recollage them and
Mm-hmm.
kind of created a bit this kind of, it's almost like a comic, like these new scenes of people relating to each other, but it becomes really nasty.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just fill them up with insults, with every insult I could think about, or like really all this foul language, like super dirty. I just wrote it. So it's a bit what is called the shit storm, which is like it's like what happens in internet when people
Yeah.
start just to like despise and insult each other and just becomes this kind of people of
Yeah.
unloading. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
bit of, yeah, to me, it's a bit of representation of this kind of like super heavy moment we're dealing with sometimes in internet or in the social media where everything just becomes poison.
Yeah. And there's an excess of noise in this, like excess of words, excess of images also. I think there's something very important to be said. And again, I think it's very beautiful how even in the most formal of your works, you do this playing between the fragment and the totality, right? And you're doing this procedural repeating, which you're doing this like tension in between the fragment and the totality. You do that in different types of works, and when you do it like not only with images, or abstract images, you do it also with representation, and you also do it with words. um how
Yeah, it's really it's something in the world that it's been always like that about having all these little pieces, but
yeah,
thousands of them, and then kind of like reordering them.
yeah,
Like when I was a kid, I bought these like very small plastic toy soldiers, which were made for maquettes, for models. And I kind of really like them. And because I also like history a lot. So I was really fascinated, let's say, by this Napoleonic armies. I was completely into them. And I remember really kind of building this kind of battlefields, you know, with these all these little toy soldiers and then destroying it. So I feel somewhere I'm like kind of repeating myself, you know, like it's like kind of this pleasure of
Absolutely.
yeah, a way of building images, which has to do with like, you know, it's very close to collage in a sense, you know, like taking
Yeah.
things from different parts and like building them together. So to me, a lot the composition, the visual composition is really about balancing all that, you know, like playing with, let's say, all these different fragments and elements.
Yeah, but the thing about collage, as I mean, collage is not just a technique; it's also a theory. And there's something very fascinating about collage, which is that it was only discovered, recently, by art history at least, or by artists as a regular technique or practice is super recent. And so it's like, I think it was late 19th century that the first collages, in a way, people say, some art historians would claim that it was the Cubist movement that invented it. Of course, people were collaging before, but the point is that there's also, like, I think it's T.J. Clark, but the art historian, he talks about how the appearance of collage is also talking about the possibility of deconstruction that is happening, at the same time, starting to happen in philosophy, and this idea of being able to rethink the idea of the narrative and the fragment, this formalist like search that was being done by literature, philosophy, and I think that, is still giving us a lot to think about.
Yeah, you make me think. For instance, I studied painting in Holland, and of course, Dutch painting and painting in Europe has such a profound and large and long history, that for me as a Mexican artist, it was super difficult to be able to connect to that. Like it was very, very difficult. So for me, I noticed that in an unconscious way, I needed to get out of painting in that way. And somehow collage, I guess because it has a much more recent history, it allowed me to have like a different possibility. So I noticed, I mean, it's not like I'm collaging all the time and everything is pasted, but most of the way of composing actually is like creating that. So it has to do a bit like with hybridization, like taking one image and then putting it next to another images and blending it together. So that's something very important. And also then in literature also becomes super important. So for instance, with Burroughs, and what he did with Baron Geising. This idea of the cutout and the mixing and
absolutely
using chance. So a lot of that, yeah, it feels like it's something very modern in that sense, but it feels still very alive.
No, but I think, it's very current. And if you think about it, the idea of the mass is a collage of people. The mass as a concept is a sum of individualities, and you can never the mass can never truly be an entity. It tries to be an entity, but it's an entity that is collaging a lot of like individualities, and I think that, Western society is so based about the idea of individuality, and at the same time, it's so based about the idea of mass, but we never want to think about the idea of the mass, and the collage puts those two things into overlap, like physically into overlap, it's very interesting.
I wrote it down because it's very nice.
Nice.
And mass is a collage of people. It's really interesting to see it that way.
I'm glad you like it, yeah.
We often think of the mass as one thing, like,
but,
like for instance, in an anthill, ants, like either there are millions of little animals or they are just one big amorph animal. What is an anthill? How when they come to this.
Well,
so this idea of the mass as also like thinking about it as like as a composition of different individualities.
Yeah,
it makes it less scary.
Yeah, it's scary and it's very dangerous politically because, I mean, we are still suffering like the legacy of the Cold War, in which you were either for the mass or the individual. And you know, those were two worldviews that could not be reconciled on different parts of like the planet, you know, and you were either with the mass or with the individual. And what we're seeing now is that the mass is the individual, and the individual needs the mass, is part of the mass, you know. So this like new rethinking of our relation into community, you know, is also very important, you know.
Because I guess that's the fear that the mass inspires in you, that you might lose your individuality, that you might like you might mass is controllable, or that the mass is uncontrollable, or that the mass will attack you or destroy you or dismember you. But it's also that once you get into it, you go into mass thinking, you know, you become this kind of, you go to the right or to the left, like everybody, you know, but you cannot just like say like, okay, see you later. But it's interesting when you subjectivize the mass.
Yeah. Well, but also, I mean, you know what you know thinking the idea of the masses as sum of individualities also like prevents the idea of one individual being able to control the mass, you know. I mean, the idea of collage is very beautiful in that regard, because when you have a collage composition, you very rarely have a very dominant element. Sometimes you do, you know, like artists do, but I mean, kind of like it's not just the way that you glue together pieces, but it's also the kind of like relationship between the fragments. That's what constitutes a collage, you know. But anyway, let's go back to SeaWorld, because we are rambling philosophy here and we are trying to discuss your work specifically. And actually, what we should discuss is very clearly seen in this sequence of images. And because then we arrive to this.
Yeah, those two pieces are connected. And actually, they are connected, for instance, with the piece that I show in Venice, with the piece of the lynching, the Life in the Falls piece, you know, with the instruments, because actually it's the same forms. So what I'm doing is to make like a group of forms, like then I transform it into some kind of typographical language, and then I'm using them in different possibilities. So for instance, these are like abstract paintings. So it becomes really like this notion of, they're also like collage, but like abstract. While for instance, the same pieces are used to tell, let's say, a figurative story in the film, you know, that you showed before. And part of the process was also like to play with the scale and play how you can deal, you know, with them. Like if they're very small, they become like text. When they are medium big, they become like paintings, for instance, as here. So it becomes really like a painting show. But then, for instance, when in the next one, there, what I did was to enlarge them and use them as the set design for a film. So it had this kind of also like improvisatory situation where I just took the forms, like the big forms, and put them together and kind of give them meaning in the moment. And then I invited my children to perform in the film. So they were the actors of the film together with an actor that I work with. And the meaning of that, I mean, it was crazy to direct my children, so that was like super difficult. But the meaning was to play with this idea of the child, that the child is able to project into an object something, you know? Like it takes a piece of wood and projects a car and then plays with a piece of wood as a car. So I was trying to find the meaning of these pieces with them. So I was putting them different exercises, like playing with, you know, the forms. And then slowly I was taking from what they were telling and kind of building the spaces. So for instance, the man in the film still is holding this shape that looks like a bow. So it becomes really about these projections. So to me, it's really about how you create meaning into form, and then also how you project that meaning so strongly that you start to create belief. So people start to go along with you and say like, oh, it's a bow, you know, and then you start to play with that. So, which is something that interests me in art a lot. But yeah, it's like a discursión, how you will say that. It's like, it's not just, I mean, they're individual pieces, but they connect together, you know, because
Yeah.
it's like bringing one to the other. So for instance, the piece I'm working now is with the same shapes. It looks very much like the background of this room, where the shapes, they overlap so much that they also start to fragment. So it's like fragmenting the fragments. So it really starts to bring into another level,
Yeah, just to
into
show
another
people the
level.
individual. Yeah. I think there's something very interesting also in the type of fragment that you choose to use as a language, because they're like, you know, they're abstract, of course, but they're not like, they're unrecognizable fragments. They're not a square or a triangle or a circle, clearly. They're not, you know, an hexagon. They're not shapes that we can very clearly like determine through our eyes. So in a way, it forces our like relationship to language, you know, and you are creating a language with shapes that we don't recognize. So it's a way, it's like a language where you cannot even recognize the phonemes, but at the same time, you can seize the language. It's not just noise. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, they are not geometrical shapes, so it's not like triangles, triangles, but in a funny way, they suggest things. So, like some look like the beak of a bird, or
Yeah.
you know, some looks like legs, or there is something you can always see, or at least I'm able to see. Like for instance, now I'm giving that language to somebody in my studio, and I'm asking her just to draw things, you know.
Oh,
So it's
nice.
really up to her. So it's interesting because it's almost like trying not to be myself who speaks the language, but letting another person and see what this person is able to express. And something interesting is that it really has like a completely different feeling, you know. So suddenly they become, you know, she's able to project her personality into the pieces, even if she's using the same pieces that I am using. So
Absolutely.
to me, it's a bit like this experiment, because, you know, it becomes interesting language in the moment where it's not the artist language that only he understands, but when you start to transmit it, and when somebody else starts to play with it and starts to understand it in a certain way. I
Absolutely.
mean,
So,
they come originally from paper cutouts. So I just
nice.
basically took these color papers and cut them with a knife, which is really connected to the Dadaist, you know, and it's really connected especially to Hans Arp. So, you know, what the Dadaists did was just to cut paper or to rip it off. So it's called the Shire, and the other I don't know. But well,
Yeah, I'm trying to
so
remember.
that
Yeah.
becomes really like the basic motifs in collage. You know, it's like you do like Mimo Rotella and break
Yeah.
posters
The
and place them
decollage.
together,
Yeah.
or that becomes the cover of the Sex Pistols famous, you know, like album, or you have the cutout. So it's really, I think that's really where it works.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you have also the idea of Photoshop, you know, the blending and creating the illusion of reality. But that I'm not yet there.
Anyway, so now let's switch a little bit to music. So this lovely piece. A lot of people in New York had the possibility to see this, but I mean, it's such an amazing piece.
Thank you. Well, this is an interactive piece, and this is interesting that you show it here in this context, because I wouldn't say it was inspired by Orellana, but was influenced by Orellana. You know, like when I saw his studio, and then I understood that he called them útiles sonoros, how you say, you know,
Yeah.
like sound tools.
Yeah.
To
Sound
me, it was
design
very
tools. Yeah.
interesting because he created this kind of concept between the instrument and the sculpture, and not only the sculpture but the tool. So how this could work. And then I was invited to go to the Calder residency. So I had this kind of possibility to be in touch with Calder's work. And then I started to understand and think how he was building the mobiles, you know, and what were the principles. And then I got kind of this moment where I was like, okay, symbols and mobiles, what will it be? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a piece I like a lot because it has it has a range between the most subtle, beautiful, quiet kind of moment, and then it can become really chaotic. So it has something very peaceful as an installation, but then in the moment it's played, you know, it starts to become almost like a seismograph. So it starts to really project the way people are. So sometimes some people in the audience are really aggressive and neurotic and they're really intense. And some people are like super sweet. Sometimes children start to use it and it becomes really chaotic. So it's a piece that I like a lot because it also has this very clear, let's say, interaction with the public.
Yes, and I think it's also like that's one of the reasons of its success, if you like, is it gives, I mean, we're used to it, because we work in the contemporary art world, but it's good to be reminded also that, people still find contemporary art a little bit oppressive sometimes. And this is a piece that is so, inviting, not that an artist should be thinking about being inviting to make an artwork. Sometimes, something that can happen every once in a while. It shouldn't be a duty to be inviting, but I think it's such a it's such a democratic piece in that regard, and that, is one of these pieces that really through participation, and through recognition of the elements, everybody can recognize these elements. Yeah.
One important feature of the piece is that it has no rules. So the rules have to be put by the guards, They have to understand, they have to deal. Oops, sorry.
And that, is one of these pieces that really through participation, through recognition of the elements, everybody can recognize.
Sorry?
No problem. I think we got like a looped version of what I was saying. But anyway, yeah. You were talking about so the rules are put by the guards, right?
Yeah, that's always the principle. So no matter which is the museum, but it's like you just put the piece and then the sticks. So people understand the sticks are there. But what happened is that, the person who has to be there the whole day is the guard, and they have to be like kind of taking care of the rooms and of the piece. And of course, there is all these chaotic moments where people start to play too long or too much, and I always tell them, okay, you have to negotiate which are the rules that you will put. And it becomes super interesting because sometimes they are like, okay, we're just gonna let one of the sticks and not the two of them. Sometimes people think, okay, let's do it every 10 minutes, like 10 minutes. Yes. Sometimes they just really like don't want to hear it anymore. But for me, it's fine, because it's a piece that creates a certain anarchy. It's also, a consequence of anarchy is also rules. So it becomes super interesting how this starts to be negotiated.
Absolutely.
I like that a lot.
Absolutely. Okay, so here we have more. I don't know if you want to comment about this a little bit.
This is a it's a series of how they're called mono one prints.
Yeah, like monocopies.
Monoprints, and actually technically they are like engravings, like they're metal engravings, but actually they are like a collection of symbols that I asked to different like drummers, and some of them were broken, and basically the idea was what happens when you ink them and you print them. So these are compositions made with symbols. This kind of reflects on the other piece.
Yeah. And but also you have here, I just wanted to point it out, again, this like composition with the fragment, like the object, it keeps being a theme all over your work. And now let me show you this sequence, which I can show a lot of photos because this is the piece you're showing at America Society now, but this is the original iteration of this piece. So I'll let you explain it to the audience. This is another mural made by muralista Carlos Morales.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a joke, an irony about muralismo, but it's a wall drawing, and I don't know if you want to explain. I mean, I'm gonna maybe show the audience this first so that they can understand.
Yeah, I mean, this is also part of this reflection I had with Joaquin, after meeting Joaquin as the symbols, that becomes a sculpture. But this idea of the instrument as a tool, and that also becomes a sculpture. So I was thinking in the güiro, which is this tropical instrument, you know, like a percussion instrument that is in all the salsa songs and many kind of music. So I made these güiros out of graphite. So they were cut, you know, in a way that from the outside. Sorry, my battery.
Almost. Yeah, what this?
In a way that, you know, they become like an instrument. So they also have a sound. Like if you hit them, they have this very subtle, strange sound that sounds between a glass and a stone. But also they become like big pencils. So they become this really like tools to draw on the wall. So it really becomes this. It's very heavy to do, I guess. You saw the process. But so it's a piece that has kind of these multiple possibilities. You know, it becomes an image, and it becomes an instrument, and it becomes a sculpture in itself. So
Absolutely. And this is a detail so people can see, you know, a little bit of the kind of like composition it creates. And here are some photographs at American Society where it's being exhibited along the work of other contemporary artists, but with the presence of these instruments of Joaquin Orellana. Here, a little one. And this photo, which I love because that's something that's actually, I must confess, in a personal note, like the view you see when you leave our office. Our office door is right next to it, and it has something very beautiful. It's a very flat work that nonetheless has a lot of like, it feels like it had relief, you know, it has a presence that, you know, it's very beautiful.
Thank you.
And just to let people know, we're also showing, but I want us to comment one more work by Carlos, but we're also showing his Video Fantasia and Video Fantasia, actually, that's the way you pronounce it in English, which is, you know, the same title as the Disney classic. Should I describe it? And please add anything you want. You know, it's this gorgeous video in which he showed Joaquin Orellana playing his instruments, you know, again in the shape of like shadows, you know, in this like black and white sense. And you see him like the same way that you see Mickey Mouse in Fantasia, like playing his instruments with his music. But anyway, it's really gorgeous, and it's really the perfect opening for the show, you know, to homage him.
Yeah, it was very nice because when I met him, I was very impacted. No, because people told me about him, and I was a bit dubitative, like, you know, like, yeah, he made these crazy instruments, what's this about? And so I imagined some kind of hippie, or, you know, I had a big prejudice. But they took me there, and then I met him, and I was like, wow, who's this person? And then we walked into his studio, and I was like, like, wow, like, this is so amazing. But he started to tell me that he studied at the Ditela in the late 60s. And suddenly I started to realize like a whole new dimension of what he was doing. Because what happened with him is that going to the Ditela, he could experiment with what was the most avant-garde technology of the day. So he could use tapes, he could use synthesizers. So he was suddenly like opening to something new. So when he returned back to Guatemala, let's say he had a new mentality, new works, new ideas, but then there was no equipment, no institution, no public, no interest, nothing. So he made like a very interesting or very smart conclusion, which was, what if he took the main, let's say, the national instrument of Guatemala, the marimba, and he gave it this kind of function that he was able to achieve, for instance, with tapes and with synthesizers. So when you think from that point of view, it becomes super interesting because they are not only like beautiful instruments, but they are also like components of a large, let's say, analog synthesizer, not even electric. So to me, I was like, wow, you know, like, this is so great. And one classical way where visual artists, we can connect with musicians, one of the most obvious ways, is by animation. You know, we draw, they make the sound. You know, like so it becomes like it's a very clear. So when he asked me what do, I didn't want to go and start with all my explanations, you know, and stuff. So I told him like I make animations, and I saw a blink in his eyes, and I saw like we could connect. So I proposed him like why shouldn't I? Why don't you make a piece and I make the animation for it?
Mm-hmm.
But then the idea to bring the screen, you know, and use his shadow, it just becomes like a very easy way to connect. So he also becomes the character of the film, you know, he becomes the source's apprentice.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very beautiful about it. So we have a few minutes, but I do want us to have a chance to see a little bit of this last beautiful work, which I know was shown recently also, these two images. But I don't know if you want to tell a little bit about it because I think it's such an important topic also, you know.
Well, this is a piece I've been talking along many times about.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's the piece I've been showing the most. You know, it
Mm-hmm.
became like I think I show it once or twice, or three times, sometimes every year.
Mm-hmm.
So I did it in 2007, and it's the first time, and maybe the only time I have this kind of night image. You know, when you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to fall asleep, and suddenly you have something appears in your mind, and you're like, "Yes, I have to do it," which normally I don't do because normally the images are not that nice the next day. But with that was super clear, like I have to do it. And it was also a time when I went to say goodbye to my grandmother. So it was also like I knew she would die soon. So, you know, it was a very emotive time. And so in a way, I think also it appeared like a vanitas, you know, as a kind of image of death in a sense, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just tried to do it as literal as possible. And first I did it in my studio. Then I
Mm-hmm.
did it in a gallery in New York in 2007 in Yvonne Lambert then. And then it took off. So it became very interesting because the piece started to travel through the art world. So it was shown, let's say, in a collection, then in a museum, was shown by Basualdo in Philadelphia. You know, it just went on.
Yeah.
But then people start to like it a lot, and and also start to influence the fashion world. So suddenly I start to find all these dresses inspired by the piece.
I
So it's a
know.
piece that has taken a life in itself. It's very interesting. It still goes on.
That's
Like this.
so magical also that a piece that you did to say goodbye to something
Yeah,
took a life on its own, right?
yeah. No, it's super
Yeah.
nice because it's always I see it reminds me of my grandmother. So in a way, it keeps her alive or connects to her.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very strange piece. I mean, I see the connection with other pieces, but let's say the others are perhaps more abstract, and this suddenly is very figurative.
Mm-hmm.
But it's you know, again, it's like a mass of little elements. In a way, it's a collage. So it's a paper collage on the wall, just like really large scale.
Yeah.
Uh, it's this mass of people, but they are butterflies. So yeah, I notice it connects to many things.
Yeah, but it's a mass also. It connects to many things, but it has a completely different like aesthetic feeling than the rest of your work, you know? But at the same
Yeah,
time, there's something, and it's a very democratic work also, you know, I think. You know, there's
yeah.
something, there's a value on that. I think we need to highlight that, you know, that people can feel comfortable with it. But at the same time, I do find, you know, other works maybe more interesting because they make me think more, you know, like the abstract
Mhm.
pieces. But there's something, you know, there's it's nice also when you see an artwork that is pleasant or that it's like powerful, you know.
Mhm. Well, I do like pop art, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this quality of pop, you know, that it really has this immediate connection to people.
Yeah,
And I think it's very difficult to achieve it, you know. It
very
seems
difficult.
similar, simple. People think it's just like almost cynical, you know, like you give
Uh-huh.
people what they want, but it's
No.
super difficult, you know.
And to do it right, even harder, you know. So few
You know,
artists can do that.
sometimes it's easier to make a complex piece than to make a simple piece.
Absolutely. Like writing simple. I mean, I don't do art. I see art and write about it, you know, but writing simple is the hardest, you know. But anyway, I mean, I think with that, that's a beautiful closing note. And I also want to make sure that Instagram doesn't cut it. But, you know, like, I mean, the difficulty of making of communicating, and at the same time, the beauty of complexity, you know?
Yeah, it's a balance. It's about
Like the
balance.
fragment and the mass, you know, it's not a true dichotomy. We just have to balance it. This was a very
Yeah.
stand talk in a way, in many of the things we talked, like about, you know, Tao. But this was a beautiful talk, and thank you so much, Carlos.
Thank you.
And I want to invite people to see the exhibition where they'll see these two amazing pieces by Carlos. The show can be seen at America Society if you are in New York, and if not, we have a lot of material in our website, so you can enjoy it as much as possible from home. And gracias,
Por
gracias.
nada. Good to
Un
see
abrazo
you.
muy grande. Chao,
Un
chao.
beso. Que estés muy bien.